lights on, so you understand the drill, but it goes out to the internet and recorded forever. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for, I think we're a little bit ahead of time, but thank you for that. Appreciate always Commissioner Lubbers being here. This is one of the, I always call the big three of state budgeting, but this is just talking about her agency more than today, more than the recommendation for the universities, but it's a very integral part of what we do, correct? So, Commissioner Lubbers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I will just say as a way to begin this conversation that...
The chairman is here. We will...
That's perfect. Start a little early. We were going to let you close, but that's okay. If you'll come up and join me, Dan.
So sorry.
Yeah. I will
It's
say
okay.
at the beginning
We started
that
early, Dan, no problem.
we will actually be talking about our philosophy around the funding and our recommendations for the institutions as well. At one point, we talked about perhaps coming again on the 14th, but if we're able to answer all your questions today, it may not be necessary for you to hear from us again on the 14th. So we'll just sort of play that by ear and see how today goes, if that's okay with you. And so I have joining me today both the chair of our commission, Dan Peterson, who I think most of you probably know. Dan is the Vice President of Government Affairs at Cook Group, and he's been on the commission for several years representing that area of the state and is currently serving as our chair. I asked him just to make a couple comments since we actually bring these recommendations to you based on a vote by the commission, and then he will step back, and Dominic Chase, who is our CFO, will join me for the remainder of the discussion. I will tell you as before he comes to join me that this is his first week as CFO, so be kind. Although I will say he's well prepared for this. One of the things that I try to do at the commission, knowing that our good people often get hired by other places, is I always try to have a bench. And so he's been a part of that bench and so he's very well prepared for the job today as well. But with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dan, our chair, to make just a few introductory comments.
Thank you, Teresa. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you so much. Nice to see all of you and appreciate your listening to my brief words. First of all, let me commend Teresa and her staff, Dominic and the rest, and reiterate what an amazing job they do. And as she says, she builds a great bench of folks. So Dom's well prepared and helped walk all of us as lay commission members, volunteer commission members, through very complicated processes, and they did it so well. With really thorough substantive information, worked very, very well with the institutions, making sure all the information was understood and correct. And so it's a really, we take it very seriously. It's a very important process, one we enjoy being a part of as commission members, but we are here to completely endorse and support Commissioner Lubbers and Dom in their presentation to you. So thank you so much for having us. I did want to just mention a couple quick things and then I'll be done, but just to kind of walk you through the process that we went through as a commission. Started actually in the spring of 16 when we worked through the discussion around performance funding metrics, if you will, and reinforced the importance of the performance funding formula and metrics. We made two quick changes to that at that point in time. We dropped the institutional defined metric in collaboration in conjunction with the institutions, and we added the 18 to 29 hour certificate programs to the metrics for the two-year institutions. In September and October, we had the institutions actually come and present their budget proposals to the commission and went through that process. In October of 2016, the Budget and Productivity Committee, along with actually I think almost every, if not every commission member, attended that meeting either in person or on phone to talk through and deliberate the budget proposal. And then followed up then in November of 16 with the unanimous vote by the commission to support the budget recommendation that you're going to hear today. So thank you for allowing me to make a few comments. I'm so sorry I was a couple minutes late, but appreciate being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. We appreciate the contributions of our commission members. This is a big job. We ask people who have other important day jobs to spend sometimes 1 or 2 days a month with us doing this work, so I'm grateful for that. And I would thank the chairman as well. He actually made a point of being at our meetings where we actually heard from the colleges and universities and heard the commission deliberate on this, so we appreciate your participation leading up to today as well. We're going to frame the discussion today for you in the context, first of all, of what our overall goal is at the commission right now, which is to ensure that 60% of Hoosiers have a quality degree or credential beyond high school. Let me be quick to always mention, which I do. This means certificates, associate degrees, four-year degrees and beyond, but that there be something that gives them the ability to go into the workplace and meet the needs of the 21st century. That number is tied, as I've had a chance to talk to you in the past, very clearly with what the workforce needs will be in Indiana by 2025, and we're getting to that point even now where about 2/3 of the jobs are requiring some sort of education beyond high school. I like to talk about this in the context of why the work that we're doing is so important, and I think it's really, we really do this in three ways. One, what we're doing really creates opportunity and builds personal prosperity, which gives us the opportunity to increase per capita income of Hoosiers. It really does meet the needs of employers that are increasingly, the needs are changing in the 21st century with a much higher level of education and skill needed than in the 20th century. And then the result of that is that we strengthen Indiana's economy, and we really develop Indiana as the kind of place where people want to stay or want to move. So with that context, let us begin with what were our goals as we considered what our recommendations would be with you today. We've tried to align the recommendations that we've made with our strategic plan. We adopted a new strategic plan this year called Reaching Higher, Delivering Value. Increasingly, as you talk to people about higher education, the word value is used. How do we know that we're getting a return on investment? We talk about value in a very broad way, not just costs, but also the value to the individual and to the state for higher education. And so the recommendations do align with Reaching Higher, Delivering Value. As part of that value discussion, not surprisingly, we talk a lot about affordability. At a time when we're telling people that education beyond high school is more important than ever, we need to ensure that they can afford to go to college and stay and complete their degrees. These recommendations will maintain Indiana's strong commitment to financial aid. Thank you so much. As members of the General Assembly, you have acknowledged that part of that affordability issue is making sure that we have financial aid for increasingly students who have been first-generation students and who need to go to college. Overall, it preserves the state's commitment to higher education. And it will increase the amount of the institution's total budget, which is funded through performance funding at a small but increasingly higher level. To discuss this today, we'll look first at Indiana in the context of the national landscape, and then we'll overview specifically the performance funding formula, the recommendations that we're talking about in terms of financial aid, the commission's budget itself, and finally, the budget recommendations overall that we're bringing to you today. When you look at the national landscape and where Indiana fits into that, you'll find that since the recession, Indiana has seen student enrollment increases that are, since the recession has passed, that we've actually seen enrollment increases that are about in line with the national average. The chart right here shows, I hope all of you have that information in front of you as well. Indiana's really at about an 8.2% increase, and the nation at about an 8.6%. And then you see exactly how that breaks out between our four-year public institutions at about 221,000, our two-year publics at about 97,000, about 85,000 students are attending private nonprofits. We are increasingly trying to get information about our proprietary sector, and as a part of the fact that we provide financial aid to students who go to proprietary schools, we believe we have the opportunity to collect data from them as well, and so you will see in the future much more data about the proprietary sector, which has been focused a lot recently because of the ITT closure. Indiana's funding for higher education actually decreased less than most states. If you look at that chart, in the same period that our funding, we looked at this funding, our funding decreases were among the lowest in the nation, well below the national average. And this chart does not show financial aid, which actually might skew this a little differently. It's important for me to mention that the charts that you're looking at right now are put together by SHIO, so they are both resident and non-resident. And keep in mind, when we talk about performance funding, it's going to be just resident students. But these charts have both resident and non-resident students in it.
Commissioner Lubbers, on this one on funding, I'm a little taken aback that Illinois has positive growth, knowing the financial status of Illinois. Is it because they were so high in the beginning part of the time period that skewed their numbers, or do you know?
Increases that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean,
Well-
Illinois is the largest growth, and I know that the last couple of years have not been kind to Illinois higher education institutions.
No, in fact, we'd have to go back a little bit further. This is, we should probably look at that number because their budgets have been certainly, the funding hasn't even gone to the higher education institutions in Illinois. And yeah, this is through 2015. They did see a significant bump last year, but the year before that, they didn't. They held their money, actually. So let's see if we can get a little more information about that. I'm a little surprised with you why Illinois would be at that level, but they did see a significant increase in the last year. Even with the fact that we saw lower decreases in higher education than most states, as you can tell by where we are, still our appropriation per FTE remains below the national average, and those numbers are indicated for you as well. But again, this does not have financial aid in it, so I think that's important to consider. I think a good news story for us has been, together with you, the improvement that we have made in this affordability area when it comes to tuitions. Indiana's tuition increases in the period that you see here from 2008 to 2015 are among the lowest in the nation. I think we've seen this for several reasons. One, in 2009, which was actually my first year at the commission, you required the commission to set non-binding targets for tuition and mandatory fees, which we have been doing in each biennia since then. I think you've seen ongoing support for the financial aid, which I think addresses the affordability issue as well, and strong leadership at many of our public institutions where they've actually said they understand that we need to do everything we can to hold tuition at affordable levels. In fact, what we have said recently is that we would hope that the institutions would either keep tuition at the same level or increase it at no higher level than the rate of inflation, which was about 1.65 the last time we did this, and most of our institutions, in fact, did meet that goal. And so you've seen schools like Purdue that announced for the 5th year that they would be freezing tuition, and IU has in Bloomington, both of the main campuses, they would be freezing tuition as well. So I think that's a good news story. Certainly the trajectory prior to that time period looked very different than it looks now. So meanwhile, if you look at the national picture, Indiana is considerably outpacing the nation in growth of degree completion. The U.S. average increase was about 21.7%, and Indiana's increase was 34.3%. Now, it's important, once again, to put this in context. Our attainment level for our adults is still not high, so this is an increase from where we've been, not an absolute number of where we fit in compared to the nation. If you include certificates, which have been growing quite rapidly, but building off of a fairly low base in terms of the number, Indiana's growth is the second highest in the nation in terms of degree completion with certificates. Yes, Senator Taylor?
Thank you. Teresa, I know we talked about this even when you were a senator, but I love to see these numbers like this, but one of the areas that I see that I can't get my hands around is the fact that the minority representation at these universities continue to decline as far as African American goes, but the graduation, because you include other minority groups, rate goes up. Is there anything being done to look at that issue, particularly at the state-funded universities? I know there's very little we can do with the private sectors, but I've talked to them about this issue as well. Have you looked at that, or is there a specific study being done as to why or what is going on at the university level?
We are very focused on it. In addition to setting the 60% attainment goal, we have a secondary goal, which is to close the achievement gap. There's no way for us to get to our 60% attainment without doing a better job with our achievement gap that exists. We disaggregate all of our reports and all of our studies by race and ethnicity. We actually have seen that while we still have an achievement gap, we have made inroads with our populations of color at a high. All the trends are in the right direction right now. The college going rate for the African American population right now is almost at the state average. We're at about 65% and it's at about 63%. The challenge for us continues to be, Senator Taylor, is we need to get them across the finish line. We have a different achievement gap with our Latino population. We have a hard time getting them to college. We have a much smaller base that we're talking of. Once they get there, they tend to complete. So we have two different ways that we need to look at this issue, but we're very focused on it. But we're seeing great progress with our 21st Century Scholars Program. So yes, we have laser vision on this because there is no way for us to get to where we need to be as a state without working on the achievement gap. And I would say look at our reports because they are all broken down that way. I want to look a little bit at performance funding, which I always do with you. We remain one of probably 3 or 4 states as a national leader in this area. That's not to say that we probably have 30 or 35 states that actually do performance funding, but they don't have the track record that we do, so they don't have the way to measure it the way that we do as well. The way that we've looked at performance funding in Indiana with your support has been to do this in an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary way. And by that I mean we have slowly, but we've continued to sustain a commitment to performance funding and increase that at a small level every year. And we've made the decision with the commission's support that whether we had, regardless of whether we had new money or not, that we would continue to be committed to performance funding, and with, generally speaking, a balance between a reallocation of new dollars and base, and a reallocation of the base. So new money and a reallocation of the base. The chart is, nobody in my office likes this chart except me, but I always say I think it's an important chart because it shows where we've been since we started. And it will show that for the last 3 biennia, we essentially have had the same metrics. Dan Peterson mentioned a few changes that I'll talk to you about, but they fit within the major metrics themselves, with the exception of the elimination of the institutionally defined metric. The challenge you have with performance funding is you want to acknowledge legitimate concerns. By the same token, every time you change, it's harder to meet that goal, and you can't measure it. So I think it's really significant that you have continued to look at performance funding essentially for the last 3 budget sessions in essentially the same way, and that's been very helpful to us. Building off of the 2017 budget, which is what we're doing today, it was 6.5% of state funding was actually based on performance. The metrics that you see on this slide are the ones that have been there essentially throughout the last 6 years. And if you look at the first 3, overall degree completion, on-time degree completion, and at-risk degree completion as measured by whether the student qualifies for Pell, about 90% of the dollars, either new or reallocated dollars in performance funding, go to those 3 metrics. What we have tried to say is that no matter what type of institution it is, whether it's a community college, a comprehensive 4-year institution, or a research institution, we need to get more students to complete. Whenever possible, we need more students to complete on time, and we need more of our at-risk students to complete. These can be stacked on top of each other, so you can get the first, the second, and the third, all 3, with additional funding, which would drive even more money to that degree completion. And then depending on the kind of mission of the institution, other metrics play out differently. And it's going to be important when you hear the institutions make their presentations that you understand that you can't look at this with you have to look at it in totality. So, for example, the high impact degree completion right now goes to research institutions. That is not to say that you don't have nursing degrees and other kinds of degrees at other institutions that are important or high-impact degrees, but they get persistence where the research institutions don't get persistence. And our community college, our two-year institutions get remediation because they're the only institutions that are really supposed to be doing remediation. So this is a very carefully crafted formula that is designed to give every institution the opportunity to earn money based on those metrics. It was mentioned by Dan as well, for the first time, in keeping with the importance of workforce and training, meeting the needs of employers in this state, we are including 18 to 29 credit certificates. A few years ago, we included one-year certificates. And so this is another way to try to look at what the state's economy needs. I think it's important to always look at these metrics to see if they're accomplishing what we want, and that's what I'm going to try to do in the next few slides. But having said that, I think that after this budget session, it's important for the commission members to again say, are we accomplishing everything we need? Is there anything new that we should be considering? Should we be tweaking this formula in some way? For example, down the road, what about the demographics of high school graduating classes, and how does that impact the number of students who enter college who then can complete college? We're still a few years away from actually seeing any downturn in that. I was reading something today, and I think up through 2025, I think we should still see about a 2% increase in high school population. But at some point, those kinds of metrics do matter. It matters the level of performance where you are. If you get to the point where you have a 90% completion rate, it's very difficult to move it beyond that. So we need to consider that. And then I think the whole area of certificates and how we measure certificates and what's included in terms of what kind of a quality certificate is, we need to consider that as well. So I would make a commitment to you today that this will be an ongoing discussion, not one that I'm asking you to consider today, but one that we will be considering after this budget session. Let's look at whether these metrics are accomplishing what they need. As you can see, overall degree completion is increasing in Indiana, 41% in the last 5 years. The number of bachelor's degrees, overall degree completion is increasing, 41% in the last 5 years. Number of bachelor's degrees, 18% in 5 years, 48% at the two-year or associate degree level. Keep in mind, again, building off of a much lower base in the associate degree area. But I think it's safe to say that the trends that you're going to see are in the right direction. I think the 18 to 29 certificate increase that you see above is a reflection both on the small base from which it's building, and then also the General Assembly actually in 2011 gave the Commission the ability to approve and disapprove programs of less than 1 year. So we are starting to follow certificates of less than 1 year. You also will find that some of these certificates will be what we call the 30 credit hour Gen Ed core. And they're getting a certificate for that, and because that is a marker on the way to transfer. So we'll be looking at this certificate area as well going forward, but I wanted to just provide a little background. The really great story, I think, for performance funding is not only degree completion, but it is the on-time completion rate, graduation rates. This is the area where we've seen the biggest success. We've been working with you on financial aid reform, where in order to receive the maximum amount of financial aid, you must be on target to graduate on time because you're going to run out of financial aid in 4 years. So there's a reason to do that. We've actually had this big 15 to Finish campaign where we've really tried to explain to students there's a difference between full-time and on-time. You could be taking 12 credit hours identified by Pell as full-time, and you're still not on target to graduate in 4 years. And so we've done a lot to explain that. I do think that if you look at this, another way that we tried to help is we said, if you will start and we're talking full-time students now, not part-time students. So if you start as a full-time student, start with at least 15 credit hours. If you drop a course, and some people will, we understand that, we give you the summer to make it up. So we look at a full calendar year now instead of 2 academic semesters. And I think that's been an important way to keep them on track. But anyway, at two-year colleges, the on-time graduation rate increased by 2.2% in 5 years. That was 11% more students completing on time. At the 4-year colleges, the on-time graduation rate increased by 9% in 5 years, with 35% more students completing on time. You don't often see this kind of movement in higher ed. So I think that the policies that you've put in place have had a huge impact. And it's because there's a huge financial impact to families if they don't complete on time. Not only do they run out of financial aid, but even if they are not getting financial aid, an extra year of college comes with a price tag of a minimum of $50,000. So there's a good reason to try to graduate on time when you can. Now, we know there's a whole nother issue for part-time students who are working and raising families, and we need to address that as well. The next slide shows both the metrics for at-risk and high-impact degrees. In 5 years, we've seen 111 more at-risk students completing degrees at Indiana institutions. Those are our Pell students. In the same 5-year period, we saw 22% more students earning degrees in those high-impact, basically primarily STEM degrees, although architecture is included in that at Ball State as well. The remediation success rate is measured by not if they pass the remediation course, but if they pass the gateway course, which is the next course after remediation. And we've seen improvement in math and English courses. The place where we still have a lot of work to do is in math. And we've actually seen a decrease in the number of students who are entering college needing remediation. This is for several reasons, some of which I think students are better prepared. We hope that's a major reason. We also know that Ivy Tech has identified students needing math remediation in a different way with 3 math pathways. So, well, people used to be on the Algebra 2 math pathway. Not everybody is put on that pathway now, which has decreased the amount of remediation. You'll notice that the 5-year trend in math course up above is negative, but the success rate actually improved the last year over year, which would account for schools are receiving some funding for remediation. It is still a very small percentage of overall performance funding. Persistence is an interesting one and one that we need to keep our eye on. It's the one that most closely follows enrollment numbers and most quickly are reflected in enrollment. So if you've seen decreases in enrollments, this would be reflected in this more quickly. If you look at the success rates, you'll see that persistent rates are holding steady or slightly increasing, but you've seen a decrease in the number of students. This is a reason why going forward when we look at this metric, we may want to alter this in the future to actually consider this as a rate instead of an actual count. The next page shows resident, yes.
Sorry. Can you explain this persistence
Yes.
thing a little bit more? Exactly what does this mean?
That means that they get additional funding if, at a 4-year institution if they get students to succeed. At the point that they get 60 credit hours, 45 or 60? 30 and 60. 30 and 60, there's additional money that's driven to that school for getting students to complete 30 or 60 on the way to completion. At a 2-year institution, they get 15, 30, and 45. So it's a benchmark measure, which we know speaks to the likelihood that they actually will complete. So we drive money to those institutions for persistence, for getting the students to persist to those markers
Okay.
of time.
And why is it that this last column where it says 5-year change is all showing everything is down?
Because what happens is, this is a reflection of primarily on the fact that enrollments are down as well. And so even though they may have, their rate stayed essentially the same and that they were getting the same number of students there, they had fewer students
Fewer
actually.
students, got
Yes.
it. Okay, thank you.
The next one does show, yes.
Very briefly, and I'm glad to hear that you said there's a rise in how our students are doing. On the 21st century, would you say that raising that from 2.0 necessity to 2.5 was maybe part of the change of our students doing better? Or what would you give the credibility to a rise in our students?
I do think with the 21st Century Scholars, that increase to 2.5 has made a difference, because if we looked at those who were getting between a 2.0 and a 2.5, they were the ones who were least likely to be succeeding when they went to college, because, not surprisingly, they weren't as academically prepared. So when we set a standard that was higher, and they knew that in order to get that, and we had many years to work on it. You know, they start in 7th and 8th grade, so we can work on this over a period of time. So I think those expectations do make a difference. We've put in place other expectations for our scholars as well that some might have been concerned would actually drive down the number of successful
Yeah.
scholars. That has not proven to be the case.
That's
good
what I'm
news.
asking, because your at-risk students are doing better, so, yeah, thank you.
If you look at the resident FTE, then this shows that the enrollment numbers at Indiana campuses. You can see the increase around the start of the recession and then the decrease post the recession. The next chart actually even tells it in an interesting way, which is you can see that the Ivy Tech has experienced about a 32% enrollment decline. Now, before we overreact to that, this would be true of community colleges around the country. Community colleges are the ones that are most responsive to the economy, and so when the economy gets better, and we're almost at full employment now, when the economy gets better, people tend to go back to work from the community college. Our message to them is finish what you've started, even if you have to work, one job instead of two and you finish, because there will be another downturn in the economy at some point. And the only difference for you is going to be you're going to be older without the credentials. So there's a reason to stick with it and finish. But those numbers are concerning to us, and I think we need to continue to make sure that we address the enrollments at our two-year institutions in Indiana. Student financial aid is the next area that we're going to look at, and thank you again. We have new numbers that just came out. I've been saying to you for years that Indiana ranks 7th in the nation and 1st in the Midwest in need-based financial aid. We now rank 5th in the nation and 1st in the Midwest in need-based financial aid. And so when you talk about affordability, it is not only, how much money you're giving to the institutions, but it is how much money students have in their pockets to actually pay for their college as well. And some states don't have the same commitment to need-based aid. Some states are more merit-based aid, but we've had a long-standing commitment, and I think rightfully so, to need-based financial aid. The next chart just shows this in another way, the increase, about a 2% increase over the last year, a 17% increase over 5 years. This includes all of our state financial aid. Primarily, this increase is due primarily to the growth in the 21st Century Scholars Program, which you saw a huge bump in that recession time when more people qualified their families to be scholars. But you also saw an increase in our other financial aid programs in Higher Education Award and Freedom of Choice, because more of those people qualified as well. So you did see a bump during that time.
You got to look around. Teresa, Commissioner Lovers, just so I make sure, being 5th in the country means we give per full-time equivalent, undergraduate full-time equivalent, the 5th highest dollar amount
Yes,
per
it's
student.
based on per student, so you actually would,
But it's based on full-time equivalent student.
yes, it is.
So how do you gauge the Ivy Techs and the other community colleges that we have? How do you put them in this formula?
Well, their full-time students still fit in there.
But a lot of them don't go. And I always think of Indiana's unique situation where we don't, you could get a tool and die or a certification as a welder in 18 months, and it doesn't require you take 12 hours of math to do.
Right.
And Indiana is known for that because we have hardworking Hoosiers who don't necessarily go to get some type of liberal degree. And I think this is good to tout, but doesn't it kind of, does being 5th in the country really point to the amount of financial aid we give students, or is it just another thing to just put into our box?
We're spending a lot of time looking at these issues because all these workforce issues are so important. I will tell you that about 100 certificates at Ivy Tech qualify for Pell. If they qualify for Pell, they qualify for state aid as well. So if it's
So they have to be an FTE in order to qualify for
they would
Pell.
qualify.
When we look at FTE, we're looking at total number of credit hours attempted divided by 30 for undergraduate students. So it really is comparing apples to apples between states. Similar to what you said, if they're going part-time, it's just divided by 30.
Okay, so you still do take them in consideration, so if it's,
It's all total credit hours attempted
Okay.
divided by 30.
all right, thank you, thank you.
So let's look at the 21st Century Scholars Program for just a moment, because it shows that this chart, in a very visible way, what happened, in the Great Recession, and then it shows the ramping up, what we actually paid, and then it shows our projections, and our projections are pretty good. I mean, we're able to calculate pretty well how we're doing, but then you'll see, beginning this year, you're going to start to see leveling off of the cost for 21st century, reflected in the fact that more people have gone back to work and not qualified for that. And so this is, I think shows why the big difference you're going to see in the amount of financial aid will come primarily in the 21st century. It's the most responsive to the economy.
Commissioner Lubbers, and maybe more for you. I'm a freshman 21st century scholar entering Indiana State. How much would you expect to pay for me over 4 years?
You'll pay whatever the tuition is at Indiana State. It's full tuition.
Okay.
Sorry, fees. So whatever Indiana State's tuition is, they would get every year.
Okay, so that's part of the issue, the pressure. I mean, it might be in my interest to increase tuition if I'm getting it fully funded on the outside level. So for you to come up with these numbers, how do you project for numbers in the cohorts out 4 or 5 years? Do you,
Assume, for our current model, we assume a 2% tuition fee increase, which is conservative considering the average came in at 1.6% for the current biennium.
but if you go to the decade prior, it's probably 8%.
It's constantly evaluated each biennium as it comes in, but it's something we look at when we're doing the tuition fee recommendation and how they come in the spring after session.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions about the 21st, about this chart. First of all, I've always wanted to see, I mean, this is sort of like, I don't want to use the word, but it's like an entitlement. Once you qualify, you're there. And so besides assuming a 2% tuition increase, what percentage of completion do you assume in this?
Well, it depends. But first, the first thing that has to happen is there has to be the affirmation that takes place. So they have to have met all their requirements.
Right.
Traditionally, we have, and this is not a great story, but it's the true story. We have about 40% of people who have affirmed, who have actually met all the requirements from the time they sign up, and then have done what they've met the grade point average. This is before this was when we had a 2.0 grade point average. So this is a historical number. We
Okay.
actually are on target this year with our new Scholar Success Program to actually be higher than that, even with a new set of expectations, because the expectations are ones that are very much aligned to college readiness. So you have that part, and then you have the completion rates once they get there.
All right, so what I'm trying to look at from a budget point of view is what kind of liability are we looking at over the future years? And so you're saying right now we've got 40% affirmed. Is that what you're building in to this chart?
40% affirmed is for the freshman year. The utilization rate actually drops each year that some people are dropping out after freshman year, sophomore year, so it does factor in all of those factors. The reason we stop here is because this is the known cohort size of the 21st Century Scholars. Next year, we'll have a new class enrolling in 7th and 8th grade, so it will continue to be a liability. But if you stop funding it, it would just look like a graph that.
All right, so this is based on what we have in the pipeline right now.
Correct, yeah,
All
that's.
right, and it doesn't in any way affect next year's group, right? Next year's group,
The new group
the
that
new
signs up,
kids, yeah,
they would
they're
be
not
considered
counted.
into the next. We would calculate them into the next time we.
Okay. All right, and so from what we're looking at right now, we're going to peak out on our obligation between 16 and 18?
We peaked out. We have peaked out.
We
This is-
have.
We have peaked. yes.
Okay.
So this is a coming down slightly.
And this is this based on, how much of this is due to the new requirements, do you think?
Most of the peaking had to do with the economy. This is a response to people who qualified as 7th and 8th graders. Their families met the financial need. They qualified for free and reduced lunch, and so it was at a higher level not surprisingly,
Right.
at the peak of the recession, and then people have gone back to work. And so this is much more to do with families' income than anything else.
Okay, and so what's happening, I know that people are transitioning now from the old requirements to the new requirements, and what does that look like? How is that going?
It's going so much better than, I mean, I panicked. I'll be honest with you. I panicked last summer because I started looking at the numbers of the people who were on target. Because even though we put this in place a long time ago, the graduating class of 2017 is the first one that has to meet that. And so we have redoubled our efforts. We are actually slightly ahead of where we were on affirmation before the new requirements. We're at like 42, 43%. We were at 40 before, and we have from now until the rest of the year to actually school year to get them there. So, and really, when you look at those 12 requirements, it's things like filling out FAFSA, doing your graduation plan, visiting a college campus, which you can do virtually. I mean, they're all things that every student should be doing. It's just that we have the lever with scholars to say, if this is a generous scholarship, in order for you to be really prepared and to increase the likelihood that you're going to be successful with this money we're investing in you, these are things you should do. And so I think it's actually, we did this in concert with our scholars, advisory council, with the schools. We all met together and sort of figured out what they were supposed to be. After you said we needed to design a scholar success program, you put it in statute and told us to do it, and that's how we did it.
All right, so one last question. So on this, where you're going, it looks like you're, what does that last number on there mean? The
Are you on the
140?
Hyperion? Which chart are you on now? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
For scholars, are you looking at scholars now?
Yes, the
Okay.
first one.
So tell me which number you're talking about.
All right,
Attendance and time.
so you've submitted everything as a baseline from the 17 appropriation, and now, what's that last line? Submitted budget FY '19 goes down?
That is our request for the appropriation for fiscal year 19 for 21st Century Scholars, and that number matches that number on the graph. That is what we expect.
Is that where, okay, is that where you're getting this? So you expect that, like you say, right now we've peaked and that we're going to actually need less money?
Correct.
Okay, but then you still have to add the new kids coming back on.
You do, and
Yeah.
Oh, is that, okay.
the other thing that we would like, and I'll talk to you about that in just a moment in terms of the size of the grants for everybody other than scholars as well, because we've been holding those to less than the 2009 level for many years, so I'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's get to the commission's budget, which is, I think, what the chairman thought I was going to be talking about today, so thank you for indulging me with a much broader discussion. So if you'll look at what our budget is, our 21st Century Awards request is decreasing, as we've just been talking about, post the recession. As you know, that the Frank O'Bannon grant is made up of the higher education grant, which is what's used for public and proprietary institutions, and the Freedom of Choice grant, which is what's for our private institutions. For Frank O'Bannon, we are going to be positioned without asking for any more money in financial aid, but because of the decreases in 21st Century and some utilization issues, we'd like to be able to bring the grant for those two to closer to what it was in 2009. We've been much lower with that grant for those other two awards, the Freedom of Choice and the Higher Education Award decreased because of the number of people who were actually needing money during that time period. And so with that, we didn't have any more money, so we had to decrease the size of the grant. We would in acknowledgement of the fact that that's been a few years ago, we would recommend that we bring it, we're not recommending that you bring it exactly to the 2009 levels, but you would be getting much closer, maybe 90% of what we were in 2009 in the recommendations we're bringing to you today. The only true increase you'll see over the biennium is associated with the Next Generation Teacher Scholarship Award, which was created last year by the legislature and which you asked the commission to oversee, which we've been doing, and I'll talk to you about that another day, but just great responses we're getting to that and a really great campaign that's underway. First year, $1.5 million was provided for, as you know, 200 high-achieving high school students, could be students in college but we had to prioritize high school students at $7,500, up to $7,500 a year. In the second year, with 200 more students coming online, it will go to $3 million, and at the point at which you have a full four years of cohorts of those students, it would be up to $6 million. All the rest of our administrative funds that the commission we're bringing to you are remaining flat. And the document that Senator Tallien was looking at, the Hyperion document, actually includes all the materials explaining that. If you have additional questions, that I know you have received this in advance, and I didn't want to just simply go through line by line with you, but I'd be happy to answer questions. So with that, the overall Commission for Higher Education recommendations to the state budget. You've seen this chart every year. We bring this to you that shows all aspects of the higher education budget at about $3.85 billion over the biennium. Operating clearly makes up the biggest portion of that at about 60% of the funding. State financial aid is the second largest at about 18%. Debt service, line items, repair and rehabilitation, and other items like the commission's budget round out all, which is included in that, everything else. So the total in fiscal year 2016-17 was about $3.85 billion, and for the budget we're bringing to you today for 17-19, it's about $3.98 billion. Broken down in the following ways, we are recommending an increase in performance funding pool from 6.5% to 7% in fiscal year 18, which would be 3.7 reallocation of the current budget and 3.5% new funds. For fiscal year 19, moving it to 8% with 4.3% reallocation and 4% new funding. We believe that the new funding levels that we're requesting really reflect the Commission's commitment to partnering with the colleges and universities on issues related to both performance funding and keeping tuition low, keeping it affordable. We are requesting that we fund the current line items that are already in the budget, with the maximum increase being the lesser. If it requested less than 3.5%, then we're recommending what that would be, but no more than a 3.5% increase. The only new line item that you have is the University of Southern Indiana. It's the only institution without sworn police officers, public safety officers, and so we are recommending that it would be important to fund the college's requested line item for security when they bring that to you. And then finally, we are continuing to maintain Indiana's commitment to early college credit by funding dual credit at what you already are funding it, which is $50 a credit hour. We now have, for the first time, the majority of high school students are graduating with some college credit, about 52%, saving the students and the families a considerable amount of money, but it will be reflected in a bump up in the cost for dual credit. But even though we're keeping the per credit hour the same. The last page of the budget recommendations here would have to do with, first, our capital requests. IU is receiving their priority request, and all of these requests are included in the information that we provided to you before, so you can go and see the requests. IU and Purdue received their priority 1 request. While State received the majority of their priority 1 request, it actually was, we're recommending a 77.6% and a small matching grant. I guess small is not small when you say 9.9 million. It's amazingly how millions just become small after a while, but a 9.9 million match from Ball State. USI was receiving their priority 1. Ivy Tech, we're recommending both priority 1 and 2, which would be the renovation of both Kokomo and Muncie. VU received 3, but it's the cost of each individual one was very small. So overall, their request is 22 million, and Indiana State receiving their priority 1 request at 15 million. I know you've talked to us before about trying to keep the debt ratio at around 10%, which we have continued to do, and this statewide debt ratio will be a little bit less than what we recommended in the last biennium, but it keeps it very close to the 10%. We're funding the repair and rehab at the levels that we did at the last 2 budget cycles, and we're maintaining funding support for financial aid. The last page is the overall recommendation. Again, it shows that the budget would be at $3.98 billion for the biennium. Slight increase over the last biennium is due to the change, primarily the change in dual credit, the additional dual credit, slight increase in operating budget. Overall, with all the components that were in that pie chart put together, it's a 2.2% increase for fiscal year 2008, and then over 2017, and then a 3% increase in fiscal year 19 over 2017. So those are not built on top of each other. You have additional information back up for all of those that I'd be happy to answer, but those are the recommendations we bring to you today with the support of the commission.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Teresa, what is Commissioner Lovers? I'm sorry, I keep doing
My
that.
name's Teresa.
Commissioner Lovers, what is the IHE debt service? What is that? The capital? Is that our capital outlay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Teresa, I know you're familiar with the ITT situation. How did we handle that budget-wise, and are the students transferring to other schools, and are they keeping their scholarships, or are they having to pay it back immediately and not attending another school? Can you tell me what's going on with ITT?
It's a mixed bag, and it really has to do with what the individual's intent is. If they want to transfer their credits, and they've been able to transfer them, and there are schools, Indiana Wesleyan is working with them, Ivy Tech is accepting some of those, it depends on the areas. There are some other schools that are doing that as well. So they, some will, and if they get their credits accepted, then obviously they're not going to have their debt raised. If, on the other hand, they are not getting their credits accepted, they're not continuing, and if they had federal loans, the federal government has indicated that those loans would be forgiven. And so that is in process right now. We're in the process of working with ITT to get all the student record information. It's not just, we also had MedTech that actually closed its doors before that, which is another Indiana domiciled school. I think it's really important that we provide as much transparency to students as they make decisions, and we're trying to do that. And I would say this is an example. We're following how students do, we followed this with passage rates on nursing, for example, and we were able to see that where students did well with their passage rates, and we had a couple proprietary schools where the passage rates were very, very low. And we had one proprietary school, Harrison, that had very high passage rates. So you have to be careful not to paint every school in a sector in the same way. But we're able to get better data now than we've ever been able to get. And a lot of this is, being determined by the federal government, but we're doing the best we can to stay on top of it for Hoosier students. Oh, yes, those students had Pell Grants, yes. Some did. No, that was a grant up front, so they never had to pay for the grants. They received that, and they don't have to pay it back.
Are there any other, because of the federal requirements, that are at risk that operate in Indiana that you know of?
Well,
Or is it appropriate to say that in a public forum?
Oh, we're following this. I think this whole concept of gainful employment, which is what has dominated a lot of these discussions at the federal level, are these people able to get a job with the degree that they get there? And so that's been a real part of this current administration. I don't know what the next administration will look like. I do think that the regulatory attitude may be somewhat different, but we're going to have to wait and see and how that impacts schools.
A lot of these recommendations, I presume, are made that the revenue forecast will be similar to this decade of revenue forecast of around 2 to 2.5%. Is that correct? Is that how these assumptions were made?
We looked at several indices around the country and around the Midwest in particular, and what increases were, and we came in very close to, around this 2.5% to 3%, which is what we have, is very much in keeping with what has been in the Midwest. Although I
If-
do really want to look at the numbers for Illinois. You've intrigued me with your Illinois question.
If Indiana, for whatever reasons, revenue forecast is less than 2%, does the commission relook at their recommendations, or will you put it in our power of Ways and Means to change those numbers to fit the forecast?
What we do is work very closely with your fiscal analysts, and they come to us on a regular basis to say, would you rework those numbers with what, for example, if it's based on 100% of the metrics for the performance funding, or is it that you give 75%, you keep the proportionality the same, and we're able to do with the system we have now, with the push of a button, we're able to move those numbers around and figure out what it means. So we're obviously going to be good partners with the legislature and be responsive to whatever you want us to do in terms of adjusting that. These are the recommendations that my commission asked me to bring to you today.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you throughout the session.
Thank you. Look forward to it. It is 3:40. We gather again at 5? 5 to 5:30. I have it 5. 5 on my calendar. What time? 5? 5 o'clock. And we're regathering at 5?
I'm waiting for you to tell us. 5?
We are adjourned. Meeting today. We're back tomorrow at 9 a.m. because we get to hear from presidents, don't we? Let me just reiterate, I stated or said that the presidents didn't necessarily have to come to this dollar, evaluation budget committee. That it was probably more important for the presidents to come in January and March to the legislature. So we have some presidents coming and some treasurers coming. So it's not that, it was the chairman's prerogative, that it wasn't necessarily the president's responsibility, because this is more of a numbers presentation for tomorrow. Thank you.